Welcome to UO Today. I'm Barbara Altman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Matt Johnson, an author and teacher of creative writing at the University of Houston. Johnson writes primarily about the lives of African Americans in the form of fiction, nonfiction, and graphic novels. Johnson's first novel, Drop, from 2000, was a Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers selection. Interview magazine named him a writer on the verge, and Drop was listed among Progressive magazine's best novels of the year. His second novel, Hunting in Harlem, 2004, won the Hurston Wright Legacy Award. Incognegro, a black and white graphic novel written by Johnson and illustrated by Warren Pleece, was published in 2008. Johnson's latest book, Pym, was released in March 2011. The Kirkus Review said it's an acutely humorous, very original story that will delight lovers of literature and fantasy alike. And Publishers Weekly said social criticism rubs shoulders with cutting satire in this high-concept adventure. Pym is caustically hilarious as it offers a memorable take on America's racial pathology and the whole ugly story of our world. Johnson read from Pym and discussed American and African American literature, comic books, and black superheroes on Thursday, May 5th, 2011, as a guest of the UO's English department. Matt, welcome to UO Today.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
We're delighted you were willing to come all the way to the West Coast to talk to us. So I have to ask you, every review talks about the autobiographical stream in your writing. You grew up in inner Philadelphia, a light-skinned African American. How has it shaped your literary career?
I think there's a lot of time when you look at artists, they're in a society and they're also outside of it. So they're a part of the world that they're writing about, but they also have enough distance from it that they can have a real perspective that encompasses, a larger kind of view. And so I think when you look at a lot of different writers, you see so many authors who are socially outside, whether it's because of sexual preference or because of some other quirk of their autobiography. So for me, as a biracial African American, and also as a biracial African American who looked to, for many people, as being white or Hispanic but not black, I was kind of in the community and also outside of it. And I think that perspective really helped later because the benefit of not quite being included in a group is that you can have this exterior view even though you're connected to it. So I think early on it helped for a variety of reasons. It helped, the isolation of being somewhat different is very good for a writer because you get used to spending time alone. The sense that you can't fully become a member even though you're a part of a group helps if you're going to be critical of it. So I think now I look back and all those like horrible little childhood annoyances and traumas, like everyone became really helpful, as an artist.
Well, good for you for turning it to the good instead of talking all that on your psychotherapist's
Right.
couch. I wanted to turn to Pym. It's gotten a lot of critical reaction already, all of it positive, since it came out a couple of months ago. When I picked up Pym and started reading about it, I didn't know that Edgar Allan Poe had written a novel, to which this is a response of sorts, or kind of a sequel, I suppose. Yeah. Edgar Allan Poe's novel is called The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, and obviously you've picked up the name of the protagonist.
Right.
What was it about Pym and Poe that inspired you to do this?
Well, I love those giants of the 19th century because they were able to do these books that were intellectually interesting and engaging and innovative, and they were really great books. But they were also page turners. And we got into this mode in the 20th century. And I think as more people became literate, as more books were published because of publishing technological innovations, there was this idea that, well, anyone can read and anyone can write a book now. So the way that we prove how great a book is by the fact that you can't even read it. Your attention span has to be almost medicinally improved to be able to get through some of these books because they're boring, and they're supposed to be boring because they're supposed to make it so that people who are not intellectually powerful enough have to put it down and turn the television on or go to something else. So we got to this point where we started defining great books in part by how unreadable they were. But you look at the 19th century and you get books like Frankenstein, you get books like Moby Dick, and you get the short stories of Poe, and they're utterly gripping, they're utterly engaging, but they're also doing more than just being page turners. They're being books that actually challenge the way we think. Now, having said all that, Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym is not a particularly good book. It's not a book that a lot of people read. So, and there's a reason, because there are pages and pages that are utterly boring. There's things that don't make any sense. There's characters that pop in and disappear for no apparent reason. And, it's a mess. And even Pym referred to it as being a silly book. And
you mean even Poe?
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Even I start to conflate the two. But and Pym the character was a stand-in for Poe, and was this, was this odd sort of twisted anagram for imp, which was representing Poe. He didn't even want to write it. He liked writing short stories, but there was this new thing that was a novelty called the novel, and it was apparently a group of linked stories that you could sell in one big bundle and make a lot of money. So because of financial considerations, he was forced to try this longer story, but he never really invested in it. He never really changed the structure to become a long form, and really it reads like it's supposed to be magazine pieces. And because of that, the book becomes radically different as it goes on. And so I was just kind of fascinated by that. But the bigger thing about Poe's Pym is that it ends with this insane cliffhanger. It starts in Nantucket. It starts as like a basic adventure tale. But as he starts going further and further south, and that's the only narrative drive, I'm going south, he ends up at this island close to the Antarctic where everyone is black, and they're so black even their teeth are black. Even the water is purple. And it just starts getting really kind of insane. And the final moments, they escape this island, him and his sort of best friend in the book, Dirk Peters. They show up at the coast of the Antarctic shelf, and they see a white shrouded figure standing on the coast. And he lifts up his hand, and a chasm opens in the ice, and the boat goes into the ice. And that's it. You don't understand who this person is. You don't understand what any of this means. And really, you know nothing more than what I just told you, because the whole thing is one paragraph and the book is over. And even though there's a foreword to the book, which Pym tells us that he's been forced to write about this adventure, in the afterword, it tells us, oh yeah, well, his boat went into the ice and he's dead. So that doesn't make sense. He wrote the foreword for the book. How could he be dead at the end? But Poe doesn't care, because he's not thinking in those ways. He's thinking it's like a magazine thing where you probably read that part 2 years ago and you've forgotten it by now, so you can just kill it off. So it's because of that ending that the book has, despite its flaws, become this gauntlet in American literature to figure out what just happened and make sense of it. So that's been on the part of critics, and it's been on the part of writers. Jules Verne tried to make sense of it and say, well, it was just magnets. It was actually a big magnet, and it pulled the boat towards it, and that's what happened, and end of story. And then Lovecraft tried to write a sequel where he basically looked at the book and said, it was a trip into madness, so I'm going to pick up from this position of madness. And he wrote this book, Mountains of Madness, set in the Antarctic, that's inspired. In some ways, Moby Dick is even inspired by Pym. But it's been this, and there are a lot of writers, lesser writers, who many of us have never heard of, tried to write sequels as well. And I just thought this was just this great challenge, is to try and make sense of this ending and try and bring it into the contemporary world.
You have some experience picking up on a pre-existing character, right?
Yeah.
In 2005, you published a 5-issue limited series graphic novel called Hellblazer Special Papa Midnight.
Right.
And there you were kind of rehabilitating, recuperating a pre-existing character.
Right.
Is there a parallel here?
Sure. I mean, we all do that with literature in general. We're having a conversation. No book stands outside of this conversation. In some ways, you're responding to the books that came before. So for me, it wasn't a huge shift to try and take existing characters and do something with them. And yeah, I started getting into comic books in 2005. I mean, I'd already been into comics. As a kid, that's what I started reading. And I didn't start reading prose novels until high school, but most of the time I was reading comic books. And the only reason I made the shift was because a comic book would cost me $1 and it would take me 20 minutes to read. But I realized for that same $1, I could buy a paperback. Or I'm dating myself with these prices, but I could buy a paperback for the same amount and it would take me 2 weeks to read. And that's when I started really getting into novels. So I had the opportunity to write a comic book, and it was based around the idea of taking this kind of stereotypical black character that was kind of the perfect noble savage archetype and turning him into a real person. So I really wanted to work with the form, so I jumped at the chance, and that was the first comic book I wrote. And then after that I wrote 3 other graphic novels.
In Pym, you've taken another kind of a stock figure of a subgenre of literature these days, the academic with an obsession. Your protagonist is an African-American college professor who doesn't get tenure because he refuses to serve on the diversity committee of his school, right? And so you're writing in another particular tradition there, but then you send him off on this incredible adventure. Can you do a quick synopsis of where your book begins and ends?
Sure.
I gave you the beginning. Where do you leave off?
Well, the academic ends up finding this lost manuscript of Dirk Peters, this character in Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. And he realizes from the book, in the book, Dirk is described by Poe the way he describes all of his black characters from his different stories, but he makes them half Indian as opposed to black. And I realized later it's probably because he needs him to start as a villain but become a central character and a friend. And you can't do that with blackness because there's the one-drop rule, and if you have any blackness, you're always going to be black. And Poe's view of blackness in general is negative. So what I did was I did the other 19th century literature that I love, which is the slave narrative, and I basically gave Dirk Peters a slave narrative. So when my main character finds this book, he realizes the entire thing was actually true, that Poe's book was actually based on reality. So he gets together a group of people to go down to the Antarctic to search for the remnants of Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym.
Okay, on that note, I'd like to ask you if you'd be willing to read a little bit.
I'd be happy to.
That's great, thanks. Where are you going to pick up? What piece are we going to get?
One of the first people he goes to get is his cousin, who is actually does deep sea mining, and he's trying to get him to put a group together to go down to the Antarctic. And this is his first meeting with his very eccentric cousin that he's never met before. This cousin is also a social activist, right? So a social activist turned deep sea miner? Right. This is the last black radical turned scuba diver. So, and it's actually, oddly enough, is based on somebody in my family, but the weirdest things in here are all based on reality. All right, well, I can't think of a better place to have you start. Okay. Booker looked like a Jane's, forehead like a block of caramel toffee, neck stolen from a giraffe, unfortunate attributes he tried to cover with a snake orgy of gray dreadlocks. As we'd planned the night before, we met in a bar in Lower Manhattan, past City Hall by the docks. I didn't like going near Wall Street. More specifically, I didn't like going near high-risk bombing targets. It just wasn't my thing. He sat in the back of the room staring intently at the front door, Malcolm X style, which, considering we were in an organic juice bar, was a little heavy for the scene. I used to come here before. Used to serve you underage if you worked the docks, he told me. Wasn't all bright with these damn lights in here. It was called Houston's. It was a place you could get stabbed with a knife. It changed me, my cousin told me, in a way that sounded like he was adding it to a long list of things in this world that had betrayed him. He asked about my motive for the expedition, and I launched into the story of Pym. As his eyes drooped, I suddenly appreciated my buddy Garth for his ability to feign the slightest interest in literary history. Next, he asked me about the family. It was clear he wasn't interested. He was just checking to see if I was really me. Once that was confirmed, Booker James cut short my family update. This bar holds a lot of memories for me. I was here taking a break from work at a dock in Brooklyn the morning the truck bomb went off at the shipping entrance of the Twin Towers. I heard the bomb go off, went outside, smelled the smoke, and saw the soot-covered people, and it all kicked in. I knew exactly what I had to do. It was time to march, he told me. Hit the last word slow and hard so that I could feel the impact, then took a swig of his carrot juice. Immediately locating a Kinko's, my cousin had a flyer typed, printed out, and copied by the 100 before the smoke had even cleared. Setting the rally for 4 hours in the future, Booker James barked the news and handed out the flyers as he took his long walk north from City Hall to 14th Street. Hours later, flyers dispensed and throat parched from calling others to the cause, Booker James arrived at his rally point at Union Square, the historic site of American civil disobedience, and received the shock of his life. Not one goddamn person came to the Twin Towers bombing rally. Not one. Not even the Negroes bothered. Not even one news crew either. And I called them all. What type of stuff is that? Not one. People just walking by. What the hell has this country come to that people won't rally against injustice? What the hell is wrong with the society that won't even bother marching anymore? But you were going to march about what? I asked my cousin, somewhat confused. What? What was I going to march about? Captain James spun in my direction, shoulders, chest, and all. When Booker James looked at you, he really looked at you with his whole body. An errant billy club in Little Rock in '64 resulted in the loss of rotation in his neck. Negro, we were going to march. Don't ask me about marching. What kind of ignorant-ass question is that? Let me tell you, I marched at Selma. I marched in Mississippi. I marched in Montgomery. I know how to march. The last sentence was delivered in a loud staccato, each word nearly a sentence in itself. I'm sorry, Captain, I'm a bit lost, I continued carefully, truly unsure as to whether I had missed some form of information. March against whom? Why? I don't understand. How would that help anything to do with the bombing? Maybe I did lack some insight, but my cousin didn't bother sharing his with me. Instead, he just stared me down, the gray snakes around his neck now still, as if steadying themselves for a lunging attack.
Wow, thank you.
Thank you.
One of the things that I'm dazzled by in this book is there's a really strong contrast between this gritty, urban, detailed setting in which you put your characters that's really full of realistic and contemporary detail about the bombings and the billy club that left him stiff in the neck. So it's really anchored in the real world of the East Coast. And then you move them all, this team of characters, into this fantastic landscape.
Yeah.
So you're going from a real kind of down-home, detailed realism to something very much other.
Yeah.
Was that a hard trajectory for you? It is a little bit for your characters.
I think it's some form of self-destruction. I think like I look now and I think I wrote 3 books. I think the first book is this kind of realist satire, and the second one goes off into science fiction, and the third one just gets crazy. And so what I found is there's some readers who really like the first part, and then they just, as soon as it goes down to Antarctic, they're like, no. And that's it, they're off the boat. And some people like that part, and they like the craziness of they basically discover monsters. And they love that kind of element. But then when it goes into the third section, where it becomes even more surreal, they're just like, no. And then some people go all the way through, and they're there for the whole ride. And the ones who go all the way through, who for whatever reason, whatever their background is, they're ready for all 3 of those types of books, then they love it. But I've also discarded all these other readers, unfortunately, to get to that point. So, no, I think the way I wrote the book to write this sequel was I kind of realized that what I saw in Poe's book was Poe's racial imagination as a white male Southerner in slavery times. He had basically imprinted his racial subconscious onto the page. So you see there this violent blackness and this perfection of whiteness and an inability to make sense of either one or find peace between those two. So what I think I did as a biracial African American was put my own racial subconscious onto the page and in some ways try to find some peace between this mythological binary of black and white.
The New York Times review of the book says you find a way to go from allegory to gory, which I thought was a great line on their part. You cover at least 4 different genres all in one.
Yeah.
And it's a pretty daring flight of fancy that I think Poe would have liked. You find a way to keep his work alive in there. Do we want to give a spoiler or not about?
Oh no! Well, yeah, Poe literally pops up at some point, so that's all I'll say. But yeah, I don't know. I was waiting for nightmares. Like I was thinking Poe's gonna haunt me. You know what I mean? Like I don't believe in ghosts, but I get a little scared when the light goes out sometimes. And I just thought I was going to have some dream with like Poe's massive head staring down at me, incriminating. But then I thought, you know what? This is helping him sell books, and he loves selling books. So I think he's actually going to be fine with it just in that case.
I have to ask you about a term, a phrase that the protagonist of your book, the narrator, Chris Janes, the professor, uses. He talks about the pathology of whiteness. He says, if we can identify how the pathology of whiteness was constructed, then we can learn how to dismantle it.
Right.
So I'm really curious about that phrase, pathology, because to me that indicates malady, taxonomies, medicalization of whiteness.
Yeah. I think, I mean, part of it, well, let me just say, my main character is a little crazy. So I will not be held responsible for any lunatic things he does. But I think on the question of whiteness, one of the things that fascinates me about American racial mythology is you take 2 different groups. You take this cluster of Europeans and you take this cluster of West Africans, and you decide that these brown people over here, they are black, and all the things about blackness mythologically we're going to put onto them, which is chaos and savagery and violence, and they represent that. And then this other group of pink people, we're going to decide these pink people are actually white, and all of the things around whiteness, the attributes of order and reason and nobility, we're going to let them be examples of that. And even though some of them are horrible, wretched, not noble, and monstrous people, they still get to keep that title. And even though some of these over here are noble, powerful people, they're still going to keep that title. And so it creates this odd binary between these 2 random ethnic groups. And I think we empower a lot of that. And I think a lot of our racial discussion today is still haunted by that. Haunted by a lot of the ideas that we came up with during the Enlightenment for how we were kind of defining ourselves. And so I think a lot of times when I see the racial discussions that we have, they seem like they're just spinning their wheels, in part because we haven't figured out new ways to kind of dismantle these issues. And so for me, one of the most important ways of doing that now is separating ourselves from that binary. So instead of having these European Americans being defined just by white, they have to be defined ethnically. And the same thing for African Americans. But I think one of the things, and I dealt with this in Incognegro, is one of the amazing things about whiteness is it doesn't see itself. So you can have Indian music, and you can have West African music, and you can have Chinese music, but then you have classical music. So it takes the ethnicity out of it. It's just classical. It's normal, and everything else is ethnic. And I think that's actually dangerous because it allows us to look at the largest ethnic group in America, the most powerful ethnic group in America, and say that they have no ethnicity at all, and that everyone else is actually has an ethnicity and has special issues, has special interests. When in fact, if we see each other fully as humans, we acknowledge all of our ethnic, variations.
Yeah, you talk about making whiteness visible.
Yeah.
right? So not being the default mode, but
Right.
but actually another color like the others.
Right.
Yeah. We don't have a whole lot of time left. I wanted to ask you very quickly. You spend a lot of time on color: pink, brown, white, black, and I was fascinated by how that comes out in the graphic novels where you've only got black and white.
Yeah. Well, that's just because they're cheap.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Well, sometimes I've done color and I do black and white. But yeah, it's the graphic novels are really interesting because in the book I give you the instructions for your imagination. You know, I tell you what it looks like. I tell you he sits in a chair, but you have to imagine the chair, right? But in a graphic novel, I have to do all of that. I mean, or I at least have to give instructions to the artist to do all of that. So it's a different sort of pressure. And the questions of color that I've dealt with in the past sometimes become complicated. And with Incognegro, we wanted, it's a book set in the 1930s about lynching. So we wanted parts of it to to look like a book from the 30s, even though people weren't doing graphic novels then, but have this kind of black and white noir feel. But it was extremely difficult to come up with a book about racial nuance where we couldn't even see color. But the exciting thing about that was that color is just one cue. We use the word color, but there are other things: the shape of your lips, the shape of your nose, the type of hair you have, the way you walk, the way you talk. And when we use this thing of black and white, it's a shorthand that allows us to get through the day, but it's also a shorthand that allows us to miss many of the more important cues that we're actually responding to.
We only have a minute left, so I want to ask you one last question, ask you for a quick reply. You talked about Poe's massive head floating in your nightmares, and it immediately made me think of the headshot you have as a publicity photo on the dust jacket
My
of
massive
Pym.
head.
It is a scary picture. That is not a user-friendly author. What was your thinking behind that?
Well, my thinking behind it was really sunny, and my eyes were squinting from the sun. I don't know. I gave them a bunch of pictures. I think for some reason they wanted the surliest one possible. I don't know. It might help intruders from breaking into my home, so I'll embrace it for that reason.
It would keep me out for sure, and I've noticed others of a similar vein.
Right.
So, but you know, it's a great lure into the book, and I want to just invite everybody to pick it up and read it for whatever part or parts they will appreciate. Matt, thanks for coming.
Thank you so much for having me.
This was really fun.
Yes, thank you.
We've been speaking with Matt Johnson, professor of creative writing at the University of Houston. He is author of Drop, Hunting in Harlem, The Great Negro Plot, Incognegro, and Pym. Johnson read from Pym and discussed American and African American literature on Thursday, May 5th, 2011, as a guest of the UO's English department. His reading was co-sponsored by the Oregon Humanities Center. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.